Okay, this is from the book of Virginia Marie Bouvier, Women and the Conquest of California, 1542 to 1840. Tucson, University of Arizona Press, 2001. This is chapter 6, Sexuality and Marriage. Spanish church authorities saw the transformation of indigenous patterns of marriage and sexuality as vital to the conquest of Alta California in general and to the success of the missions in particular. Like religious, cultural, and political conversion, this transformation was predicted upon the Franciscans' belief in the absolute superiority of Spanish Catholic civilization. Catholic codes of sexual behavior included chastity, restraint, monogamy, and the elimination of sexual activity outside the sacrament of marriage. Franciscan discouraged, criticized the sexual vices of the Indians as measured against these Judeo Christian norms. In the previous chapter, I analyzed how a discourse critical of premission indigenous gender roles provided an ideological justification for conquest. In this chapter, I argue that a discourse critical of indigenous gender relations and sexuality functions similarly. The transformation of indigenous sexual behavior and marriage practices legitimated the evangelization project. The implicit, if not explicit, argument in favor of imposing Hispanic Catholic values centered on a critique of indigenous sexual practices, including polygamy and divorce. The Franciscans used this critique to advance an argument that the Indians, especially the women, were better off at the missions than they had been in indigenous society. The Franciscans represented indigenous sexual practices as being at odds with the Christian notion of the family. When asked to respond to a government questionnaire in 1812 about which vices were dominant among the neophytes and in which sex, the prelates almost unanimously listed licentiousness, and more than two-thirds of the respondents named debauchery as the prevailing vice among the Indians at their mission. Ecclesiastic authorities decreed the incontinence, the unfaithfulness, and the polygamous practices of the Indians, and the willingness of Californian Indian husbands to barter or gamble away their wives. The depiction of the Indians as heathens who were sexually loose, unfaithful spouses, and polygamists made the Californian conquest a moral crusade. The friars saw control of native sexuality as fundamental to their mission. Missionary priest Louis Armstrong, Antonio Martinez, and Antonio Rodriguez from San Luis Obispo observed that idleness and the inevitable lust to which it gave rise had the potential to undermine the conquest itself. They observed the Indians are naturally given to vice since from their infancy they have no occupations whatsoever, and they survive on whatever the day provides for them. They live in idleness, and thus they are full of vice, the chief one being lust, which soon finishes off the men as well as the women. If something is not done to remedy these results, the conquest will soon come to an end. Father Jose Sanan from San Buenaventura mission also linked idleness with the unchasteness. The three main vices, he wrote, were idleness, incontinence, and tendency to steal. Many friars saw promiscuity as reflection a lack of industry, whereas sexual restraint was believed to encourage rational, productive behavior. Finding a way to reduce litigious would perpetually also make the Indians more industrious. The priests maintained that the evangelization effort in California depended on changing the sexual patterns of their new flock, particularly as the proliferation of venereal diseases contributed to a dramatic population decline. At San Gabriel Mission, one of the oldest missions, Father Louis Gill and Father Jose Maria de Zalvadia lamented that promiscuity had penetrated the Indians to the very marrow of the with venereal diseases, such that many newborns showed immediate evidence of the only patrimony their parents gave them. The chief disease among the Indians at virtually all of the Alta California missions was venereal disease, which was the missionary fathers at San Miguel Mission wrote, carrying them to the grave rapidly. The San Antonio fathers attributed such deaths to indigenous lustfulness. Medical reports of the time likewise blamed the Indians for contracting venereal diseases. In his report on medical conditions in California in 1805, Jose Vicuna Marua charged that indigenous illnesses, particularly syphilis, were due to unavoidable or voluntary sought causes. The unavoidable factors he listed tended to be climatic and environmental: cold weather, scanty clothing, bad weather, the lack of vegetables, and badly prepared meat. On the other hand, the voluntarily sought factors that perpetuated their diseases were related to the character and lifestyle of the Indians themselves, their nakedness, their mixing with others who were infected, their carnal disorders, and their natural abandon. These factors were aggravated, according to Vicuna Muro, by the Indians' rejection of European rational medicine. Unquote. Vicuna Muro effectively absolved the Spaniards of responsibility for the onset or spread of the diseases. A poor diet was hardly unavoidable, and the Indians, even those who chose to be at the missions, did not voluntarily seek to overcrowded conditions. They sometimes endured. In the context of a power struggle between the settlers of Los Angeles Pueblo, established in 1781, and the San Gabriel missionaries, the latter broke with the patterns, blaming the Indians for the venereal diseases they had contracted and pointed to the settlers as the culprits. When Sergeant Xavier Alvarado, commissioner for the town of Los Angeles, charged the fathers Jose Miguel and Jose Maria Zalvadia, the missionaries of San Gabriel, had twice refused to answer sick calls from settlers in Los Angeles. The priests wrote a scathing response. They noted that a putrid and contagious malady had begun to show itself at the San Gabriel mission following Anza's first exploratory excursion in 1774. The disease had, quote, spread among the Indians here to such an extent that soon as a child is born, it already has in itself this contagion. As a result, the missionary priests were too busy attending the sick and dying of the mission to be available for the pueblos and presidios. This unusual example notwithstanding, the Franciscans' discourse and practices often found fault with indigenous sexuality patterns, and their policies centered on changing indigenous sexual relations. Control over intimate relations would reinforce the power of the conquerors on a psychological level, and on a more pragmatic level, stabilize the population by slowing the death rate from venereal disease. Christianization and Hispanicization converged in the institution of marriage, which, in the eyes of the friars and the crown, provided the antidote to a heathen condition that permitted or encouraged unchasteness, infidelity, and polygamy. Although the formation of Christian families demanded monogamous behavior, almost certainly the missionaries exaggerated the extent of polygamy among the indigenous masses. Polygamy, when it was practiced, appears to have been restricted to the leadership of many Californian tribes. For the groups whose leaders did practice polygamy, there appears to have been an important socio-political function. For the multitude of wives, H.G. Richardson, an early California pioneer, and noted that the chiefs in the Yerba Buena region around today's San Francisco possessed 11 wives, the sub-chiefs 9, and the warriors 2 wives, or as many more as they were able to care for. Multiple wives were helpful in times of war, Richardson observed, because while in an actual engagement with other tribes, the women would always follow and assist in securing the wounded from off the field battle, as well as packing all of the provisions of the tribe in their arms, while their papooses were slung upon their backs. Hugo Reid wrote that in the Los Angeles area, chiefs had 1, 2, or 3 wives, as their inclinations dictated, while other members of the community had only 1. Chiefs of the coastal Miwok to the north of San Francisco Bay often had 2 wives, but the practice appears to have ended by the late Mexican period. The Russian observer P. Kostromytynov noted that by the late 1830s, the Miwoks no longer permitted men to have more than 1 wife, although in earlier times the Toyons used to have 2 wives. His reluctant informants seem to have tailored their responses according to what they knew of Christian marriage practices. They were careful to assure Khrushchev that even in earlier times the bigamists exposed themselves to ridicule for their practices. Nowadays, they told him, this custom has vanished completely. In addition to expressing Christian intolerance of polygamy, the Franciscans censored the separation of or divorce of a married couple. Throughout Alta California, most indigenous spouses were able to leave marriage at will. The friars observed that non-Christian and Indian couples remained married only as long as they desired, that is, as long as both were satisfied and lived in harmony, or until the man found another woman who pleased him more. The facility with which spouses broke their matrimonial bonds was a source of consternation for the priests. The missionaries at San Buenaventura were amazed at the facility with which the male Indians take and divorce their wives. What really astonished them, however, was that women divorce their husbands frequently too. Neither party, the priest wrote, cares for nor understands the indisposable bond. A Spanish visitor, Jose Bandino, observed in 1828 that divorce was common among the California Indians. According to the Bandino, marriage was contracted with a young Indian girl's father who demanded from the fiancé a quantity of glass beads reflective of the merit the daughter is presumed to have. Divorce was obtained upon the return of the gift to the husband. Spousal abuse occurred among the Indians and was one reason given the separation separating spouses at the missions. Hugo Reid wrote that among the Gabrielini Indians of Los Angeles County, if a woman's husband ill-used her or continued to beat her in a cruel manner, she informed her relatives, who collected together all the money which she had been paid in at the marriage and took it to the husband's hut, where they exchanged the money for his wife, literally purchasing her return. The wife was then remarried to a new spouse. Attitudes toward adultery varied among indigenous groups. In California, sanctions against women adulterers were harsh in theory, but often more lenient in practice. Among the Gabrielinos, the exchange of wives was considered legal, and the wife had no recourse but to submit. In cases of female adultery, a Gabrielina Indian husband was technically permitted to kill or injure an offending wife without any intervention of chief or tribe. More commonly, however, the wronged husband informed the wife's paramour that he was at liberty to keep her. The husband then took possession of the lover's spouse and lived with her. Spousal swapping was thus accepted as a legitimate consequence of adultery. Among the Chumash in the Channel Islands region near today's Santa Barbara, indigenous tradition and practice differed somewhat. According to Fernando Libreado Kitspawat, a Chumash Indian who was born in 1804 at the village of Swahil on Santa Cruz Island and soon thereafter taken to the mainland and baptized. There were 3 pestilences that obliterated nearly all of the Indians. The last of these was a civil war that began at Muwo because, quote, because in those ancient days the punishment for adultery was very severe. Labrado noted that his grandfather had told him that if a woman was unfaithful, she was sentenced to be shot 3 times with arrows by an executioner. On such occasion, they would seat the woman down before the people and execute her, unquote. However, at an unspecified point in time, apparently prior to the mission period, the Chamus considered the death penalty for adulterous women to be excessive and rebelled against this practice. When one of their leaders sought to enact the death penalty for an adulterous woman, civil war broke out among the people. Following the war, the victorious leader was unanimously asked by the people to do away with the capital punishment, which he did. Labrado's narrative reminds us of the variation over time and place with regard to attitudes towards sexuality and marriage. Most of the missionaries rejected the legitimacy of indigenous marriage ceremonies. The missionaries at San Miguel wrote that in pre-mission times, mere natural love in the single man and woman was sufficient to unite them and have themselves regarded as married, unquote. The priests note that the more sensible ones have asked for their bride from their parents or relatives, so that after baptism it has been necessary to have them renew their marriage consent. Ironically, indigenous and Hispanic marriage practices shared some similarities in theory and often in practice. Marriage choices were made largely by men in the various societies in colonial Latin America. Marriage policies offered the government a convenient vehicle for controlling social change. They codified Spanish ideas about gender relations while also reflecting the shifting power relations of the time. In the late 18th century, legal norms became increasingly restrictive for Hispanic women as the Bourbon reform strengthened the patriarchal family and the state at the expense of the church. The royal pragmatisha of 1776 which was extended to Spain's American colonies in 1778, embodied many of the Spanish attitudes of the time about race, class, and gender. It required parental consent for use under the age of 25 to marry, and it upheld parents' rights to oppose their children's choice of mate. In the Americas, however, obtaining parental consent for a marriage was not always possible, either because it was not known who the parents were or because the parents were unavailable. Thus, parental consent was not required for mulattoes, negros, coyotes, and similar races in the Americas, unless those individuals were officials or distinguished themselves from the others by their reputation, good service, etc., and therefore were obliged to respect their parents. In publishing the Pragmatica in California, the Audiencia of Mexican cited a case in Guanajuato that had been particularly offensive and that illustrates the nature of Spanish gender ideologies of the time. In that case, Juan Antonio Lopez and Dona Maria Manuela de Arnido y Luis wished to marry despite the objections of her father. The alcalde, mayor, or judge at Guanajuato ruled in favor of the father and counseled disinheritance. The recommended punishment for ignoring the parents' wishes in such cases. The disappointed suitors appealed to higher authorities in the Audiencia and Justicia, who upheld the father's objections to circumvent her husband's objections. The mother proposed to leave her inheritance and even to increase it to account for the loss of her husband's share. To both her daughter and her daughter's suitor, after broad consultations with the Council of the Indies and the Crown's attorney, the king determined that such an action constituted a dangerous, quote, lack of subordination of the woman to her husband, unquote, in order to conserve her family honor, and so that women might recognize the authority of their consort as the head of the family, unquote. The king prohibited women from leaving their inheritance to children who contracted marriage against their father's will. This decree aligned the crown squarely with the husband when parents disagreed over their children's marriage choices, and it upheld a husband's authority to overrule his wife's support of their children's marriage choices. Marriage policies allowed parents to control their children, husbands to control their wives, and mission priests to control the Indians. The Crown used the law and policies of incentives or distinctives to encourage or inhibit race mixture as it saw fit on the California frontier. It encouraged interethnic marriages, especially early on, as it had done in New Spain, the Spanish Crown Promised Land, and other incentives to single Spanish soldiers who married Christianized Indian women, granting these interethnic couples land to be worked. Spanish policymakers believed would put more land under cultivation and would provide the Indians for further instruction in cultivating it, and would address the problem of food shortages on the frontier, unquote. The intermarriage program was never consistent and never achieved tremendous success, but the policies did find some qualified success early on in the Monterey region. The first marriages between Spanish soldiers and Indian neophytes took place at the San Carlos Mission in 1773, when three Catalan soldiers married respectively Margarita Dominguez, Maria Serafina, and Maria de Gracia, probably their Spanish baptismal names. Father Junipero Serra reported that the couples had already begun to have children by the following year, as the authorities had desired. He pleaded to the viceroy on behalf of the Christian Catalan soldiers for the furlough, 2 years' salary, and 5 years' ration that had been promised to the men if they married the Indian women. All three soldiers had assured Father Serra that without the promised incentives they never would have done so. The women, forced to leave their homes, families, and crops, did not speak their husband's language. Although church regulations prohibited forced marriages, protests would have been difficult to register under such circumstances. Sarah lamented that, quote, when, without trying them up, they can be made to follow their husbands, it must be with great disgust on their part and on the part of their relatives. Sarah argued that the soldiers who married Indian women from the missions should not be expected to stay at their presidios, but should be excused from military duty, move to the missions, and dedicate themselves to working the land and raising their family. Sorry, this is a copy of my instructor gave me. Sorry about that. The crown and the missionaries hoped that legitimating unions between the cultures would check the rapid spread of venereal disease, gain the trust of the natives, reduce the incidences of rape, diffuse tensions between the two cultures, and create kinship ties that would ensure the Indians' loyalty. Indian women who married Spanish men gained for their husbands, and sometimes for themselves, legitimate title to Spanish mission land. Spanish men gained access to the labor of their wives' community, which often ensured the production of foodstuffs for the soldiers and his cohorts. The women might have seen the marriages as avenues for protecting their future. They might have believed the Spaniards were powerful shamans, or they might have made political calculations based on the Spaniards' superior force of arms. Such marriages provided them with an opportunity to leave the mission compound and thereby escape the withdrawal scrutiny of the Franciscan missionaries and the Lavaras. Spain's promotion of intermarriage elucidated in relation to its ability to attract Hispanic families and marriage prospects to Alta California. Antonio Castaneda's research has shown that rates of intermarriages between Spanish soldiers and settlers on one hand and Christianized American Indian women on the other were high in the initial period when Hispanic women on the frontier were relatively scarce. From 1773 to 1778, such intermarriages accounted for some 37% of all the marriages contracted in the Monterey area. 16 of the 43 marriages recorded in Monterey between 1773 and 1778 were between Spanish mestizos, black or other casta, mixed background men, and indigenous women. Between 1790 and 1795, as Spaniards policymakers planned new colonization ventures, the Crown reversed its land incentive programs and stopped entitling Hispanic settlers to receive mission lands when they married neophyte women. Although government authorities did not actively oppose interethnic marriages, recall that in 1797, Viceroy Brancefort had given his approval for marriages between the Catalina soldiers and Christianized Amerindian women. Intermarriage rates declined dramatically in the absence of land incentives. After 1798, no intermarriages were recorded in the Monterey region. By 1800, some 24 marriages, most of these at San Carlos Mission, had been recorded between Neophyte women and Spanish soldiers in all of the Alta California. In addition to the lack of incentives, the strong bonds between the Neophyte women and their families and poor quality of prospective husbands, according to the friars, also seem to have inhibited greater intermarriage. Pre-mission customs among most Californian tribes gave young indigenous women little choice regarding their marriage partners. Parents contracted marriages for their children, although the latter's wishes were not usually ignored. According to the friars' account, marriages among the pagan Indians usually occurred when the groom or his representative, either his father or a brother, went to the house of the bride of her closest relative and asked for her hand. The groom then offered a gift to the girl or her parents, which, if accepted, sealed the marriage contract. Variations arose in terms of who did the asking: the groom himself, the father, a brother, and a relative who granted the request. Parents of the bride, or both, who received the gift, father of the bride, female relations, or both, and when the couple was considered to be married, after verbal consent was given, after gifts were accepted, or after the pair lived together. I will conclude here. This will be the end of part 1, chapter 6. I'm so sorry. It's very tough to read this.